All right. Well, welcome everyone to our latest episode of the B2B Book Club. Really excited to have y'all here. This is so new. We don't have a logo for the B2B Book Club. We're just getting it going. We're just go press and play, press and record. And boy, there's so many books out there. It seems like, especially now as the world changes in B2B. We wanted to start this series, the B2B Book Club, knowing that there's a lot of good books out there. There's a few good sales and marketing books and a small handful of what we consider really great ones. So really started this series to curate and bring to you some of the best books that we've found that I think providing good guidance for sales and marketing leaders. Very excited to have with us today Frank Cespedes. He is a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School and author of the recent book, Sales Management That Works, How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing. Frank, thanks so much for joining us today.
Matt, thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Now, we had the really bad weather this last weekend here on the West Coast. It sounds like it's making its way over to you now in just classic nor'easter fashion. So hopefully we keep your internet up and everything else. But boy, talk about a book that really sort of hits at the right time. You know, like in a world that never stops changing. In the midst of a pandemic that never appears to not want to go away, which has exacerbated changes in the selling environment. What an interesting time to write this book. Tell me a little bit about what were some of the things you saw in the B2B world that sort of were the impetus for writing this book?
Well, I think it's a good question. You know, the world is not waiting breathlessly for yet another book about sales. In fact, this is just a factoid you might find interesting. If you go to Amazon, go to the book section, click on sales, out will come over 80,000 stock keeping units. Far as I can tell, the only management topic that gets more SKUs at Amazon is, quote, leadership, gets about 90,000, but wow. Sales is a close second. I had two motivations in writing the book. One is basically a professional motivation. Of all the business functions, sales is the most context specific. Selling software is different than selling capital goods, different than selling professional services. Also depends upon where you're selling. Selling in North America is different than selling in Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, etc. And yet, of all the business activities, sales is that area where, for some reason, people feel most comfortable making huge generalizations, usually unsupported by any data, beyond what in academia we would call N equals 1. When I sold for Oracle, when we invested in PayPal,
right.
That kind of thing. So, as somebody who's run a business, has been researching this topic for 30 years, I wanted to write a book that says, look, this is what research does and doesn't tell you about this core activity. And I think you're right. I think it's also a particularly good time for a book like this. There is no doubt whatsoever that digital and online technologies and the sustained data revolution, which will continue throughout our lives, no doubt they are affecting selling and marketing. But again, my reading of what people say about this is that they simply misunderstand the managerial implications and frankly are out of touch with the data. So that was my motivation for adding to the flood of books about sales.
Well, and one thing I liked about the book and the approach you took was that obviously we have to address this incredible amount of data we have, this increasingly digital environment for marketing and sales. And yet we continue to sort of sell in a human to human way, right? Even if you're doing complex B2B, like you don't email a building, right? You don't the brand is not going to sign the check. You're still talking to people. How are you seeing companies successfully marry digital opportunities and all this information while still keeping the sales process a very human-centered process?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. The first thing, and I've learned over the years that this is a very important first step with most business issues. The first step is to take out the trash, get rid of the garbage, make sure that you are in touch with the facts. And the reality is many executives are not. Here's my favorite example. What is e-commerce as a percentage of total retail sales in the US? What percentage is that? And include Amazon in that. Include in this figure, people who may buy online but pay in the store or vice versa. This is what the Department of Commerce does. Before the pandemic, that figure was about 11.4%. Now, when I ask executives, what do you think that number was? I typically get estimates from 30 to 60%. In other words, these folks are not a little bit off, they're orders of magnitude off. Now, what has happened during the pandemic? The most relevant data is the second quarter of last year, 2020, because that's when, thus far, let's cross our fingers, but thus far, that was maximum lockdown conditions in the US and many other countries. Now, obviously, or at least it seems obvious to me, that when stores are closed, when they're held to 25 to 50% of their capacity, when consumers legitimately feel that if they go into a store, they may catch a virus and die, obviously there's going to be more buying and selling online. Second quarter of 2020, what was that percentage of e-commerce as a percentage of retail sales? About 15%. In other words, it went up less than 5%, and it's been trending down every quarter since then. It is a myth. I must repeat that. It is a myth that we are in a digital eats physical world. We are in an omni-channel buying world. Consumers and prospects are online, offline multiple times during their buying journeys. And that is a very, very big deal. It affects core sales tasks and sales management requirements. It also, if I can add, affects the relationship between marketing and sales. And as a broad generalization, what the technology is doing is allowing sales groups to do activities that as recently as less than a decade ago would clearly have been in marketing's domain: lead generation, content marketing, right? And the issue, to put it bluntly, is whether these sales groups know what the hell they're doing when they do these things. There's a reason we've had marketing groups and sales groups, but their activities are getting increasingly blurred.
Wow. I guess I'm shocked as well at that 11 to 15% number, right? I would have assumed, like, you include Amazon and everything else. Like, I think there's an assumption that it's all going far more. And do you think, is that a function of convenience? Is that a function of choice? Is that a function of like where things typically are? Or do you think this is a trend that we're going to continue to see, that for a lot of purchases, people still prefer to do it offline?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I mean, again, you can't talk to people in tech businesses about that. They're biased. The pandemic has not been an equal opportunity plague. There are some boards I sit on where it just crushed the business within less than a month. And for many tech firms, it's been a good thing. It's been, one of the best things that's happened to them. But I think what is lost sight of in this sustained revolution is that buying and selling have always been social as well as economic transactions. And I don't think 1 or 2 or 3 years of again, once in a century pandemic changes that. But what is changed is how people buy. Yeah. Again, it's an omni-channel world. It's the days of having these sterile debates about should we be online, should we be in person. My feeling is those days are long gone by the third decade of the 21st century. Companies must do both, but that's a very significant change in skills, in organization, in incentives, and a variety of other core areas.
We're talking today on B2B Book Club with Frank Cespedes, senior lecturer at Harvard Business School, in his book, new book, Sales Management That Works. I think, when I get asked by marketers like what books they should be reading, my first answer is go read what the sales experts are talking about. I think too often, like we say, okay, like as marketers, we want to learn more about marketing and we need to learn more about marketing. But today's successful B2B marketers, they're successful because they understand the language of sales, they understand how sales operates. If for the marketing leaders listening and watching us today, why should marketing leaders read this book as well?
Well, one is exactly the reason you're mentioning. I mean, the reality in business is that if you look at budgets, if you look at, in many ways where the organizational power is, especially in B2B businesses, that tends to be more on the sales side than marketing. To the extent that marketing defines its role as primarily top of funnel activities, they need to know what goes on in the rest of the funnel. So that's number one. Number two is life is unfair. When marketers complain about this, I always sort of quote the line in the gangster movies. Remember, you chose this life. The reality, and this is not simply a function of the internet, this has been true for a century. The reality is that metrics are simply much kinder to bottom of funnel activities. It is so much easier to document cause and effect in what sales does than in what marketing does. So marketing has always labored under that misconception. And then my third comment, I'd like to think that that my book, among others, helps here, as well as making sure you understand customer acquisition and retention in your firm. And again, at the end of the day, I don't much care whether we call that marketing, sales, or asparagus, but you've got to understand the full activity there. Marketing is also responsible for staying up to date with buying behavior as it works today, not yesterday. Nobody ever made much money in business just singing songs about the good old days. Right? If you're a manager in a business, you get paid to manage today and tomorrow, not yesterday. And again, that's part of what my book is about. The big revolution is in buying. And that's a big deal if you're in the marketing or sales world.
I love that you brought that up. I think that, I think the some of the most successful chief marketing officers I know today really think of themselves as chief market officers, where they're not just orchestrating campaigns in marketing. They're thinking about what is my addressable market? What should my addressable market be? What's the subset of that market that we should really be selling to and why? And your comment about buying is super important. Like so often we think of sales as our sales process, where if that doesn't map to the way your customers buy, and if that hasn't evolved to the way that they're buying and considering and researching things today, which, as we talked before we got started, it's not like there's not, I remember the book Selling to Vito, the very important top officer. Like, she may still exist, but she's got a committee of people she's working with to sort of decide whether they're going to move forward on something. Right. Yeah. So, that comment about the buying behavior and owning that is super important. What are some things you're seeing? And we're going to wrap up here this last question and let you go. What are things you're seeing that are best practices in having sales and marketing management work together? Like, it's one thing to go to sales kickoff and say we agree, but like what are they on Tuesday? Like, what are the things that help that management more operationally work?
Yeah, well, let me step back, and I'm going to cite some data that, again, may surprise a number of our viewers, listeners. And then I want to point out the implications of this, because I think the pandemic, out of necessity, has made companies aware of this. Here's the data. And again, obviously, this data will vary by industry and company. But on average, if you ask how much time does a salesperson spend in customer contact? And by customer contact, I don't simply mean making a pitch, whether it's via Zoom or in person. I mean all forms of customer contact, emails, webinar, demos, etc. What the data says is, on average, that tends to be between 30 and 35%. Now, think about the impact in most businesses if you can make that 40%, 45%, nirvana, 50% or more. That is not only an enormous productivity boost in most businesses, it also increases the total addressable market.
Right.
because segments that were uneconomic to reach now become feasible. The pandemic, I think, has demonstrated to many companies that they, in effect, were overpaying for many of their sales tasks, lead generation. We don't need our most expensive enterprise reps doing that.
Right.
We can do that in other ways, demos, etc. In other words, what the pandemic has initiated, and I don't think this will go away. I do think this is a long-term continuing impact. They now look, good companies, best practice companies now look at how they deploy marketing, sales, and post-sales customer success resources in order to increase selling and prospecting time, make sure that marketing expertise is being utilized where it counts, and especially in land and expand models, customer success very often is in the better position to do that than either sales or marketing. And again, the implications of this are just starting to roll out. So Matt, that's one of the things I'd point to for Tuesday morning.
Yeah, I love it. Well, this has been great. We want to try to keep these, tight and efficient, and really appreciate your time, Frank. Definitely go to Amazon, check out this book, Sales Management That Works: How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing. The answers to these questions will continue to evolve, but you got to start somewhere. I thought this book was a great guide. So thank you again, Frank, for the book, and thanks for joining us today.
Matt, my thanks to you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back again shortly with another episode of our B2B Book Club. Thanks for watching.